chairing the first panel of the day. And I want to first introduce our first speaker, Peggy McCracken. Peggy McCracken is the Mary Fair Crowshaw Professor of Humanities at the University of Michigan and Professor of French, Women's Studies, and Comparative Literature. Her publications on medieval French literature and culture include The Romance of Adultery, Queenship and Sexual Transgression in Old French Literature, The Curse of Eve, The Wound of the Hero, Blood, Gender, and Medieval Literature, the co-authored Marie de France, A Critical Companion, and In Search of the Christian Buddha, How an Asian Sage Became a Christian Saint, and 5 co-edited collections. Her latest book is In the Skin of a Beast, Sovereignty and Animality in Medieval France, and her current project, tentatively titled Ovidian Ecologies, studies ecological thinking in medieval French translations of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Her talk today is titled The World on Fire.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to go first so I can relax and enjoy the rest of the conference. I take as my subject here a fictional account of an anthropogenic environmental event. My text is a 14th century Ovid moralisé, or the moralized Ovid, and its account of the ecological devastation caused by Phaeton's crash in the chariot of the sun god. The Ovid moralisé is the first full translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses into French, and in this text the pagan stories are not just translated but interpreted. The translator identifies historical people or events that could have inspired mythological stories, and then he interprets them allegorically to explain how the pagan stories actually speak Christian truths. The moralizing translator of the Ovid moralisé is primarily concerned with the salvation of souls, not the salvation of the planet. And yet in his translation and interpretations of the Phaeton story, the two come together. The translator has to explain the theological significance of environmental destruction and climate change. So here, I want to read the Ovid moralisé as a historical text and as a theoretical text. My goal is not so much to shift the dates of our entrance into the Anthropocene as to suggest that imagining human influence on the environment has a very long history. But I also want to identify and explore the terms through which understandings of the natural world are articulated and debated, and in particular to investigate the vocabulary of animacy that describes suffering in this medieval text, most prominently in the lamentation of a suffering world on fire. And finally, I want to suggest that history can speak beyond an explanation of the past to suggest ways of understanding the future. I begin in 1967, the late Middle Ages. In that year, medieval historian Lynn White published a now famous, if not infamous, essay entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. In this brief essay, originally an address to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, White argued that in the modern world, the alliance of scientific knowledge and technical mastery of nature has created an environmental crisis, and he located the beliefs that allowed or encouraged this development in Christianity. According to White, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. In Christianity, man shares in great measure God's transcendence of nature, holding dominion over all animals and over nature itself. In contrast to ancient paganism, Christianity established a dualism of human and nature, and also insisted that it is God's will that humans exploit nature for their own proper ends. In White's words, by destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects.
The desacralization of nature made its destruction ideologically justifiable, and the technological innovations of the Middle Ages facilitated the exploitation of the world. So, in other words, changes in religious attitudes during the European Middle Ages, combined with the development of technologies and practices in agriculture, forestry, and the use of water to cause enduring environmental damage. In the more than 50 years since his essay was published, White's claims have provoked a broad range of contestation as well as endorsement from historians, theologians, and ecologists, and the general consensus seems to be that he was not entirely wrong. That is, while the broad sweep of his claims is no doubt exaggerated, the technological innovations White identifies did indeed contribute to environmental degradation through agricultural exploitation, and the view of humans as masters of nature probably did lead to a lost understanding of the animacy of the natural world. My goal is not to detail this large literature of response, but instead, and first, to note that the European Middle Ages has had a central place in a certain strain of thinking about anthropogenic environmental change. And second, I want to use the so-called Lynn White thesis to ground an exploration of the relationship between animacy and nature in the Ovid Moralisé. That is, to explore a medieval literary text that engages the themes of White's thesis about human agency, environmental disaster, and the displacement of animism by the hierarchies of being ordered in Christian theology. I want to explore the explanations of environmental disaster in my text and the extent to which they recognize the animacy of nature, even as they valorize human being, human exceptionalism, and human salvation. In other words, I want to foreground the way that a notion of animacy, an animate earth, an animated earth, a notion of animacy structures, both explicitly and implicitly, a didactic text about environmental catastrophe. So I offer not a modern retrospective view of the relationship between medieval Christianity and the environment, but an exploration of the deliberations of one medieval cleric who strives to explain how a pagan story about the world on fire can recount Christian truth. And so I turn to the Ovid Moralisé. The French translation of the Phaeton story follows Ovid pretty closely, and it begins with a question about paternity. The mortal boy, Phaeton, goes to the splendid palace of the sun god to confront Phoebus and to ask if the sun god is his father. You see Phoebus here surrounded by the rays of the sun. Phoebus reassures Phaeton that he is indeed his son, and the god promises the boy anything he wishes, a promise he would make only to his son, he claims. Phaeton immediately asks to drive the sun god's chariot. Phoebus attempts to dissuade his son from his stubborn demand, explaining the dangers of the route, the strength required to guide the horses, the frightful dizzying vertigo of the way through the sky. But Phaeton is insistent. His father has promised, and he will have his ride through the heavens. Phoebus, resigned to keeping his vow, describes the route, cautioning his son. To distribute the heat evenly in the world and the skies, you must hold to the route and not go too high or too low. You will scorch the earth if you ride too low, and if you go too high, you will burn the sky. Hold to the middle, and you will be safe. The Phaeton story is, of course, a lesson about moderation. The boy sets out in his chariot, but he's not strong enough to control the horses, and the frightening creatures of the heavens frighten and disorient them. Phaeton saw the scorpion, the translator tells us, and you see it here. And he was very afraid, and because of his fear, he dropped the reins he held. And when the horses felt that the reins had been released, they run freely up and down wherever their desire sends them. Phaeton loses control of the chariot. He comes too close to earth, and he sets it on fire. Ovid details the destruction, enumerating the many mountains that burn and the many rivers that run dry because of the scorching heat. The medieval translator reproduces and greatly expands this list, adding specifically many French rivers to the account. Le Rhône en Lyon, en Bourgogne, Seine à Paris et en Pontoise, une rivière conduite de l'Oise, Loire à Orléans à Saint-Yonne, et Atastariste à Narbonne. So the translator insists on the global reach of the disaster while also localizing it in France. The medieval translation of Ovid's story grounds disaster in a concrete geography that maps the scale of global devastation. But like Ovid, the medieval translator insists on the scale of conflagration in the voice of a suffering earth. That is, an animate earth expresses her agony in a lament to the god Jupiter. I am entirely scorched and burned, the earth complains. Je suis toute ars et échaudée. Is this then the reward that you give me for all the many fruits I provide, grasses for cattle and horses, and wheat, rye, and other grains for people to eat? I have always served you willingly, but now pain and suffering are my reward. Do not let the world perish in this way. If anything still survives, protect it from destruction so that it does not die now. In this way, the earth sorrowed and lamented and made her complaint to God. She cannot endure the pain or the anguish of the heat. She plunges her face deep within herself near the chasms. Son vie repent en soi-même, profondément près des abîmes. The story represents a suffering earth, an animate earth, an earth that turns away from disaster, turning into herself. The rubric introducing this manuscript illumination here records the human action that sets the world on fire. Phaéton qui fit ardoire tout le monde. And the image represents a rather static landscape, calmly aflame, whereas the text records the violent movements of the suffering earth. Pleine d'angoisse et de douleur, s'abaisse et crôle durement, et fait par son grand mouvement toutes choses crôlées ensemble. In response to the earth's complaint, Jupiter tries to summon rain, but can find no moisture in the burning air. He decides to use fire to quench fire, and he throws a lightning bolt, striking Phaeton, who falls to earth. The horses scatter, and the burning chariot is destroyed. Here is Phaeton falling to the earth, and here the illuminator has showed the horses freed from the constraint. The translation of the Phaeton story in the Ovid Moralisé repeatedly emphasizes that the young man's pride leads to his death. So this is the translator's first moralizing intervention. But as I noted above, this text layers interpretation on the Ovidian stories, offering first a historical or Euhemerist interpretation. Now I will explain to you through history how the fable could be true. Or, vous répondrez par histoire comment la fable sera vraie. In the translator's first explanation of an event that could have inspired the story, he identifies a drought in Ethiopia, such a great burning, arsur, that it burned fields and dried waters and caused beasts and men to die from the heat. The layering of interpretations, literal, historical, allegory, this layering of interpretations is a common medieval reading strategy. But I want to note that it also characterizes modern receptions of Ovid's story. The blazing trace of Phaeton's crash and fall to earth has long been taken as a geomyth, that is, a folkloric story that represents the garbled explanation of some actual geologic event, usually a natural catastrophe, as one critic explains. In the geomythological reading of the Phaeton story, we see the mythic representation of the fall of a large meteorite. This is for you, Phil. And the most recent geomythic hypothesis associates the story of Phaeton's fall with a meteorite that crashed to the earth between 2000 and 428 BCE and left a crater in southeast Germany, and I've even got a picture of it. Now, this claim appears to be much disputed, and I don't have the competencies to evaluate, but I mention it here to point out that the geomythical reading of the Phaeton story continues into the 21st century. Like the medieval translator of Ovid, modern scientists locate the origin of the story in a natural event. For Ovid and the Ovid Moralisé, a drought. For modern scientists, the fall of a meteorite to Earth. As I'll explain in a minute, the medieval translator also gives allegorical or figural readings of Ovid's story. And allegorical readings are also part of the modern use of Phaeton's story, deployed to emphasize human agency in relation to climate change. So, for example, when climate scientist Carrie Emanuel describes two ways of thinking about the Earth in terms of cosmic stability or man-made disaster, he associates Phaeton with the latter. Like it or not, he writes, we have been handed Phaeton's reins, and we will have to learn to use them if we are to avoid his fate. So in modern interpretations, the Phaeton story records natural history, or it is a cautionary tale about human hubris and the devastation of the planet. But this is also the view of the medieval translator, that is, he too identifies the Phaeton story as a myth about climate change. Like Ovid, the medieval translator claims that Phaeton's ride, too close to the earth, created the deserts. The watery sea has become a sea of dust. Ce qui fut jadis mer aigueuse devint par le chaud mer poudreuse. And then he explains that a drought in Ethiopia inspired this story about the sea becoming dust. For the Ovid Moralisé translator, the Phaeton myth is both an ideological story about climate change and it is a myth inspired by climate change. But the story can have another meaning, the narrator tells us. There's another way that it can speak historical truth. Autre sentence y peut avoir par histoire accordable à voir. In a second historical interpretation of the story, the translator identifies Phaeton as a man of learning. Phaeton fut homme qui de clergisseau. This Phaeton cleric wanted to learn about astronomy and nature, the narrator tells us. He wanted to understand the movement of the sun, how it is situated among the planets, what causes the weather to change and the length of the days. In other words, he wanted to understand what animates the world. But this Phaeton was a bad scholar. He studied badly, the translator tells us. He wrote a book that was full of errors, and Jupiter, a man of superior knowledge, had the book destroyed. Phaeton the cleric, full of pride and anger, threw himself off a mountain and died. This is why the story says that Phaeton fell from the sky, the translator explains. Now, this is quite an interpretation of the story, though not so different from many in this collection in its imaginative reach. I think what is notable about this interpretation is its emphasis on failure, on a failed attempt to understand the animation of the world. The brief historicizing anecdote does not tell us the method Phaeton brought to his failed attempt to explain the movement and order of the world, nor does it describe the successful or more convincing methods of Jupiter, his intellectual rival. But in representing a failed intellectual understanding of the order of nature, the Ovid Moralisé translator implicitly suggests that the only way to understand the animation of the earth is through the animating rhetoric of allegory. As the translator moves to yet another meaning of the story, avoir y peut autre sentence, he describes the divine order of the universe. God, who created the world, also governs it. He placed the sun and the moon in the firmament. He regulates the weather, and he divides time into seasons, years, months, weeks, hours, and moments. He orders everything according to his will. Tout ordonne à sa devise. It is he who guides the sun's chariot, the translator explains. It is he who illuminates all things. He is science and doctrine. He guides and rules the world and the Holy Church. As the allegorical reading goes on, we learn that Phaeton represents God, who gives charge of his chariot to the Pope, who should guide the faithful. But popes are now entirely corrupt, the translator explains in a long rant that goes on for about 100 lines. And because of the corruption of the clergy led by the Pope, the church laments. So the animated earth of the Ovidian story is identified as a figural representation of the animated church, who served, feared, worshiped God, and gave spiritual nourishment to all human nature, and quenched the thirst for discipline and salvific doctrine. But now the fountains that used to be full of holy preaching have run dry, and the whole church is corrupted and destroyed by the actions of those who should govern her. Clerical corruption is burning down the world, the Ovid Moralisé translator claims, and only God can intervene to save it. The environmental catastrophe of the Phaeton story is taken as a figural representation of spiritual devastation, and the earth's vulnerability to human action represents the church's vulnerability to the corruption of her human leaders. But wait, there's more. The fable can be explained in a different way, the translator adds. It has another meaning. Phaeton can represent the Antichrist. He will corrupt Christian belief and Christian order. The fountains of preaching will dry up, and the earth will burn with iniquity. This is how the fable can be true, the translator explains. The time will come when the sky and earth and sea will burn, and the prideful unfaithful will be condemned. The layering of interpretations upon the Ovidian story is what the Ovid Moralisé does. The many interpretations of the story, the explanations of historical and spiritual truth, are the form of the text didacticism. The translator is interested in Ovid's Metamorphoses as a source of moral and Christian meaning, and whatever animism we might find in the pagan text is subject to reinterpretation as the animating gesture of the Creator God who formed the firmaments, defined the movement of the heavens and the hours of the day, in whom science is joined with doctrine and natural order with belief. If there's a hierarchy of animacy in the Ovid Moralisé, the animating and ordering functions of divine creation are at the very top. Yet the firm certainty of the translator's Christian explanations may be unsettled by the explicit juxtaposition of science and theology in this story, the only one in the collection, I believe, to represent human curiosity about the natural world as an intellectual project. That is, the interpretation of Phaeton as a scholar who wants to understand how the natural world is ordered, what animates the physical and temporal movement of the world, introduces scientific knowledge alongside theological understandings of the world. Even though Phaeton the cleric is a bad scholar, bested by Jupiter, his intellectual superior, who bans Phaeton's book and causes the angry and prideful scholar to cast himself from a mountain, even so, this historicizing interpretation still represents knowledge about the earth as a science, not explicitly here tied to theology. And I think the Phaeton story calls attention to natural disaster and the question of how to explain it in a way that is unique in the Ovid Moralisé, in part because the burning earth is not easily incorporated into Christian history. Unlike the story of Jupiter's destruction of the world by water, explained in the Ovid Moralisé as a figural account of the biblical flood, the destruction of the world by fire and Jupiter's subsequent repair of the scorched earth require more imagination. And I think that by cycling back repeatedly to reinterpret the story, the author suggests the difficulty of containing the animation of the earth, and we glimpse the slippery nature of the redefinition of environmental catastrophe as spiritual corruption. The several historical and theological interpretations represent disaster as inspired by both human and divine agents. And this is what I want to emphasize, as a disaster suffered by animate things. A world on fire that laments her pain, a church that complains of corruption, a future in which the reign of the Antichrist will bring about divine destruction of the world. I'm trying to suggest that the nexus of the Phaeton story and its multiple interpretations resists the repeated rhetorical gesture that would explain the animate suffering earth as a figure for something else. That is, animacy continues to surface. And it's not just that the story animates or inspires allegory, or that allegory animates interpretation through personification, but that animacy as a concept pervades all these narratives. And I wonder if the pervasive way that animacy, animates the Phaeton story and its interpretations, I wonder if animacy is not so much repressed or erased or negated in Christian understandings of the natural world as appropriated, deployed as a concept that recognizes suffering and gives suffering voice. And I wonder if animacy may point to a medieval eco-theology in the Ovid moralisé, insofar as such an eco-theology might be located not in a divinely mandated care for the planet, as in some modern eco-theological formulations, or as might be suggested in a similar medieval example, St. Francis's care for the inhabitants and objects of the natural world, but instead located in the rhetoric of theological understanding that uses animacy to understand suffering. So, not simply a recognition of pagan animism in the Christian text, and different from a recognition of the agency of objects themselves, the eco-theology of the Ovid moralisé uses notions of animacy to describe the suffering of things, the burning planet, the corrupted church, the devastation of the apocalypse. Even as the text subsumes the animate world into Christian meaning, it recognizes suffering as the experience of an animate nature. In Ovid's account and in the Old French translation, the Metamorphoses are about human vulnerability. People are subject to the desires of the gods. People are transformed into animals, plants, elements, and things. But the world, too, is vulnerable, subject to divine will and divine desires, but also to human demands, human desires, and human affects like pride. When translated into Christian context, pagan animistic views of nature are interpreted in terms of a natural world subject to a divinely authorized human authority. But in the Ovid moralisé, I'm trying to argue, notions of animacy also suggest a recognition of the feelings of objects. Notions of animacy define the terms through which we understand the relationships between the world and the people who live in the world, who would make sense of the world, and who would learn how it is animated.